I am Vinnie Tortorich, and folks, here we are again on the Friday show. You know what that means. Your good intentions have been stolen, but don't worry. I'm here to help you get them back. You may be soft and succulent when you start this process, but hang in there. Before long, you will be lean and mean. You just have to trust the process. On the Friday show, I like to bring in luminaries, and this woman has been on the show probably more than anyone else. But don't worry, she'll be on again and again and again. As long as I could get her on, she will come on. And here's why. Every time I go on to Twitter, every couple of months, I'll go and they'll go, "Hey, man, have you ever heard of Nina Teicholz?" And I'll go, "Hey, man, have you ever, you claim to know every podcast I do?" The woman's been on more than anyone else on the Friday show, and that's for good reason. She's got the goods. So without any further ado, Nina Teicholz, how you doing, Pumpkin?
Hi, Vinny. It's so good to see you.
Thanks for
Thanks
coming
for
back.
having me on your show.
Nina, I love that you come on, and you're one of those voices. You have a book that I read once and listened to twice. Because after I read it, I bought the audio because whenever I like something, I'll listen to it after I read it. And it's funny how I have somewhat of a photographic memory of things I read. I could tell you what page it was on and so on and so forth. But when you use a different sense, when you use your ears as opposed to your eyes and you're using a different sense. And usually I'm listening while I'm hiking or riding a bike or doing something else. You pick up different nuances from this stuff. So it's interesting to me. And then after I read it once, Serena had never read it and she wanted to read it. I think it was after she met you. We all had dinner one night down in San Diego. And she goes, "Do you have that book?" And I said, "I do. But we also have it in our Audible account." So she started listening to it while she was running. And then she and I took a hike the next day and she was listening to it again the next day. And I said, "Take it out of the ears. Just let it ring." We were up on a hike. No one was around. We weren't going to bother anyone except a couple of deer and squirrel. And she was playing it again. And that night I went, "Ooh, I got to listen to it again. I got it," because the information is that good. Nina, I'm not blowing smoke up your ass here. The information is that good.
Thank you.
Let's give the audience, it took you 10 years to get the whole book put together, right?
Almost 10 years. Yeah. Well, it did take me that long because I had to go back. I mean, it was incredible. Look, the book starts with this huge mystery, which is how do we all get to become so fat and sick? And why do we believe what we believe about fat and cholesterol and saturated fat and meat? How is it that we have all these nutritional beliefs and we see that seem to be based on such strong science and all the experts believe them? And yet at the same time, you look around and from the 1970s, if you go back and watch footage in the 1970s, like everybody's impossibly thin. You can look up people waiting in line to catch a Star Wars movie. It's like there's not a single fat person. And now we're a nation of sick people. So that's to start, with that mystery, and then to go back and read nutrition science back to the late 1800s to today, thousands and thousands of papers. I probably read 10,000 papers. And to realize there's this incredible scientific trail of ideas. I guess everybody knows the basic story, which is just that there was this hypothesis that saturated fat, cholesterol, dietary cholesterol were all bad for health and cause heart disease. And that started to be our dominant idea in the 1950s. And it was just this complete runaway train of bad advice that could never be proven to be true, despite being tested more than any other idea in the history of nutrition science. Multiple large randomized controlled clinical trials all over the world could not prove this idea to be true, these ideas to be true. And yet, we continue to this day with them because, we, for all kinds of really fascinating reasons, there's just this kind of rigor mortis set in over this dogma that came to be believed in. And it's fascinating on so many different levels because scientists who realize this is wrong, even today, they have to twist their words to sort of to not be thrown out of kind of the nutrition establishment, because they're realizing the data is taking them in a totally different direction. So it's a story about science and about scientists, and then about all the forces that act on them, the food industry, the pharmaceutical industry, the intractability of government institutions, the surprisingly ideological aspect of diet and nutrition, because it's something that we eat. We have to eat at least most of us, several times a day, and food is very personal. It transmits culture. It involves animals, which is a whole other, touchy subject now. So it was really, it's just it's an ongoing huge topic. And we see, when I started, I was really almost kind of unaware of the new wave of diet wars that we're now under. But, there's just waves and waves of diet wars that we see happening. And so part of what I do is I just try to reveal, what are the forces behind those diet wars and what does the science really say?
Well, when you started, okay, so the book has been out for a while. You started 10 years before that. What year did you actually start? When did you say, okay, I'm going to start putting pen to paper, or at least start looking into the research? Because even though you're not a scientist, you're a journalist, but which, naturally makes you curious. Your dad was a scientist, so you have that DNA, so to speak. What year was that you said, I'm going to start looking into this?
Yeah, it was the early 2000s. Because I had been assigned a story by Gourmet magazine to look into trans fats. And initially I was going to write a book on trans fats, but I realized that the whole story of dietary fat generally, good fat, bad fat, what kind of fat do you eat or not eat, that was a much, much bigger story. So from the early 2000s, I was really, for the first 2 years, I just interviewed the whole world of vegetable oil scientists, the whole industry of vegetable oil, which is completely fascinating. And then I sort of moved on from there. When I started, I was a vegetarian, in that I definitely didn't eat red meat for at least 2 decades. Didn't eat butter, avoided cheese, ate mostly bread, pasta, fruits, vegetables. I was not a lot, but significantly heavier than I am now. So, and I'm from Berkeley, California. So I came out of the crucible of vegetarianism.
Yeah.
And so all my biases were in the complete opposite direction of what I ended up finding. It took me a long time. And part of my process was I just had to kind of move my head towards this other idea that was so alien to me.
So when they ask you to write an article and you agree to it, did the article come out within that 2 years? Or that, for someone who makes a living on writing an article, you got to pop that out, right?
Yeah, in the magazine world is a little bit more relaxed, but I wrote it, I think usually, you have a few months at least. So that article came out 2003 or 2004. It was one of the top read articles that Gourmet magazine had ever published. And in her memoir, Ruth Reichel, the editor-in-chief of that magazine, some people might remember her, also a famous writer herself, she said in her memoir, it was one of the articles that she was most proud to have published, because it was so risky, because we took on some of her advertisers, like Procter and Gamble, which made Crisco oil. Yes. And they were very nervous about publishing that article. And I didn't even know that at the time, because I had on record scientists from the vegetable oil industry saying that it was their job to stand up at scientific meetings and basically heckle opposing scientists, anybody who was asking any questions about vegetable oils or impugning their healthfulness. It was the job of these scientists who worked for the Vegetable Oil Association in the US to basically to try to drive these scientists out of the field, to impugn their work, to cast doubt on it, to always rebut it, right? In one case, trying to get an article yanked from a journal before it was even published. I mean, it's such a dirty world of science. But here I was writing about it, and it certainly didn't look good for Procter and Gamble. And that made the magazine. It was, it was part of the Hearst empire. So yeah. They're not, they're a little risk averse.
Yeah, so yeah, they can handle it.
Print. I think, I think it's probably harder today to get things like that out into the media.
Look, even though we like to sit around and brag that, the gatekeepers have been taken away because of the internet, but now there's a whole new set of gatekeepers. I can put something on, this podcast is going to be also part of YouTube, right? If someone decides they don't like this on YouTube, it goes away. No questions, no answers. There's no court of law. There's nothing. YouTube says, we don't like what you and Nina were talking about. We'll just make that go away. They can do that. Go on.
And Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. And, right. And I know, I now have a whole collection of stories from experts in the area of nutrition who have had their videos removed because they're about the ketogenic diet and they don't like it, or because they're talking about meat, even though they're talking about, animal husbandry practices that go back for millennia. That's now, to talk about meat, to say, I like bacon is something that a friend of mine had flagged and taken off Facebook. So the low carb group in Brazil had their entire Facebook site with tens and tens of thousands of people on it just removed. And so there's a lot of banning or shadow banning of the low carb movement, because I believe, this is just a hypothesis, but because it's a group that although it's very possible to be vegetarian or even vegan and low carb, it's a lot harder. And so it's a group that tends to embrace animal foods more because they're natural, they're healthy, they're high in protein and fat, which do not cause your blood glucose to spike, as opposed to carbohydrate-based foods. And these companies, Sergey Brin, who owns Google, Mark Zuckerberg, who owns Facebook. Anyway, they're part of a group that has dedicated themselves, this billionaires club has dedicated themselves to, fixing the problem of climate change. And that currently means greatly reducing or eliminating ruminant animals, particularly cows. And so they see it as part of their mission to, eliminate even conversation about, anything that's positive about eating meat. And they don't, they don't understand the nutritional arguments. They don't understand that people need to eat meat for vitamins, essential vitamins and minerals that they cannot get from plant foods. They don't understand they're more bioavailable from animal foods. They just look at that. They see meat. They've been told it's bad for the climate, and so that's part of their platform, I think, whether they state it or not.
Yeah, I have a Facebook group, Vinnie Tortorich's No Sugars, No Grains, and it's a private group, and we've gotten citations from Facebook over and over again. And I'm not making this, I couldn't make this up. If they ever shut us down, I have all of this stuff. We took photos, internet photos of it, whatever you call that. And they cited us for things like the term bacon fat, saying that this is hate speech. Bacon fat, hate speech. Can you imagine? And by the way, if just me saying that on this, who says that YouTube is not going to say, hey, you said fat and you were fat shaming bacon or something, whatever their claim is, they can do it, and there is no recourse. But going back to you and the Hearst magazine, yeah, they have FU money, and they can just print whatever they want, and they're not going to be taken down. And I applaud them for running that article, but it also got you going in a direction of diving in, a vegetarian diving in, because you couldn't unsee the truth. And we're going to talk about that in just a second, folks. We're talking about meat here, and Belcampo is where you want to get your meat. Belcampo.com. They came on right before the beginning of this year. Belcampo has been with us for several months. I will tell you this: I don't even call Belcampo to check in, and there's a reason why I don't. They've been letting us run with this 20% discount for the past, I don't know, month and a half. And I'm scared if someone over at Belcampo looks around and goes, oh, wait, we're losing money on every sale by giving you guys 20% off. Meat is very expensive. There's not a great markup. They're trying to get you guys in the door with the 20% deal. Don't miss out. Belcampo, B as in boy, ELCAMPO, Belcampo.com. Promo code Vinnie, VINNIE. Do not fall asleep on the keto meatballs. They don't have any kind of flour or any kind of anything you're going to hate in that. Anna Vocino will eat them cold. That says something when an Italian will eat a meatball cold. I'm not that risky. I like to heat them up. But they're delicious. Check out everything they have there. I even get my bone broth. I've gotten lazy on making bone broth because Belcampo has it. It's convenient. I can just get it right there. Also, the New York strip is not something you ever want to fall asleep on. I had one, it's Tuesday. We're recording this. I had it last night. I had to think about what I ate last night. I had Belcampo for dinner. I had a New York strip. Delicious. You want to check it out. Belcampo.com, promo code Vinnie, 20% off. If you spend over $100 after the discount, you will also get free shipping. So buy yourself a good $130, $140 worth of meat, get that 20% discount and free shipping by putting in promo code Vinnie, VINNIE, no wimpy Y, Belcampo.com. We're talking to the woman who penned the book, Big Fat Surprise, one of my favorite books, Nina Teicholz. She's also been in both of my movies, Fat a Documentary 2, and she's a perennial all-star on this Friday podcast. Nina, let's go back, because people who don't know you or not familiar with you. So you start the book after you write this article, or are you compiling information? You can't unsee what you saw. How does that happen for you?
After my article, I was sort of flooded with book contract offers, and I was able to get a book contract to write a book about trans fats, which I started off doing. Then I morphed that into a book, the current book, which is really the focus of the book is on saturated fat. So although it also covers, total fat, do we really need to be eating a low fat diet? But its main focus is saturated fats bad for health? And that's actually, I didn't know that was the book that I was writing, but when I finally gave it to my editor, she said, "Oh, Nina, this is what your book is about." So we kind of honed it and focused it to really bring that out. But it also, it has a couple of chapters on trans fats, which I think are important now, because now that we've pretty much eradicated them from the U.S. food supply, there's all sorts of deeply worrisome questions about what's replaced them, particularly in restaurants where they heat oils. And then there's a chapter in my book about the Mediterranean diet and what a kind of phony concept that is as sold to the American public, which doesn't reflect at all what's going on in the Mediterranean, and how that was a marketing concept really, and just how it came about. So that was my tour, and there was a whole chapter on fish oils that I never published, that we took out, that I may still put together and publish that. But Yeah, it's really, I think that book remains probably, it really was the first time that for a general audience that the argument had ever been made in a comprehensive way that saturated fats were not bad for health. I mean, I think in that way, it's fair to say that it was a groundbreaking book, and it got all kinds of recognition when it came out, and it was reviewed by the BMJ, the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, the Lancet as being an important book. Those are all top medical journals. So it got an amazing amount of serious attention. And it got some pretty angry reaction by people in the nutrition establishment that it wasn't just my arguments and the high profileness of them, but also I did actually name names of people who are still active today. So yeah, like if you get the Harvard Health newsletter and think that's good science, I mean, it's important to read this book. That's in there, and the names of those people are in my book. And so there's still a lot of people who really just would wish that it didn't exist. And the battle still goes on, and the battle on saturated fat really, there's been many chapters of that battle since, and we can talk about that if you like.
I would, because, one of the things that is important to realize with your book is that you took the same studies that they used to bastardize saturated fat to prove that saturated fats were not bad for you. Is that correct? Or am I putting words in your mouth? Because that's the way I read it.
Yeah, I mean, some of the science has been grossly distorted. So, in many cases, astonishingly, the conclusions, which are usually the only part of the paper that any busy medical doctor or even academic will read, the conclusions completely contradict the data. Right. So there are all sorts of ways in which papers have been twisted by the authors themselves, or they're cited to support an argument when actually the conclusion says the exact opposite of what they're cited for. So they're sort of lying through citation. But then there's an actually, I think, equally important story, which is that the large clinical trials on saturated fat that I described earlier, which were conducted all around the world on at least, say, 65,000 people, which is an enormous number of people to be tested in a rigorous clinical trial. Right. You don't do studies anywhere near that size nowadays. Those studies were buried. They were buried, ignored, not cited, not part of the reviews of the clinical literature. They were basically just ignored. Some of them were misrepresented, as you say, wrongly cited, or the data out of them was cherry picked. But a number of them were just simply, deep sixed. And it wasn't until really my book that, and to some extent the work of Gary Taubes, but really, my book was the beginning of scientists all over the world unearthing those trials, re-examining them, finding trials that I hadn't even heard of, and then doing reviews of those trials, such that now we have almost 20, what we call review papers that look at all those. Sorry, I should restate that. There are nearly 20 systematic reviews of all these clinical trials, which nearly universally conclude that saturated fats have no effect on heart disease. And they universally conclude that they have no effect on cardiovascular mortality or total mortality. So, how long you live, saturated fats has no effect on that. And the effect on heart disease is if it exists, it's tiny or zero.
Well,
so
hang on. When we talk about, you mentioned Gary, and I think it's important to bring him up in this context, because Good Calorie, Bad Calorie came out at some point.
2007.
Yeah. And you were working on your research at that point, I'm guessing. And that had to feel good for you that something was coming out, or did you read it at that point? Or, did you go, oh, good, someone is on track and what I'm getting ready to explode with Was there anything there for you, or how does that work?
Yeah, Gary Taubes's book, Good Calories, Bad Calories, and his work before that, he did sort of versions of that in Science Magazine, New York Times cover story. I mean, I cover that in my book. I talk about him as a groundbreaking journalist, and I sort of talk about his pioneering role in this field, and devote quite a bit of space to that. So yes, it was incredibly, his work is incredibly important, and really all of us who've come subsequently have depended upon his work.
Yeah.
I mean, there were people before Gary that are less well known. There was a former editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association who didn't actually, self-published this huge compendium of all the scientific literature in the whole field and his interpretation of it. And we have all gone back and relied upon his work. He's almost never cited or known. And then there's a Swedish scientist named Uffe Ravenskov. And he's also a pioneer, but less well known. Wrote a book called Cholesterol Myths that's been translated into like 20 something languages. And then there was a journalist at the Atlantic magazine, whose name escapes me, but he wrote an article about the phoniness of the idea that the cholesterol that you eat is a problem for the cholesterol in your blood.
Right.
And that was, also an incredibly well-read article at the time, but all these things had, come up, and there had been some publicity, and then it submerged, and then it came up again, and then it submerged. So I think what's happened now is that there's just an accumulation of people, starting with Gary, myself, and now there's just, there are hundreds of books and writers and people who are talking about this, doing podcasts, writing about it. There are conferences around these topics. There's a whole field of nutrition that's blossomed and reached universities around the world. It's really, the environment for science has changed. The environment of the experts at the top and the gatekeepers who control our guidelines, that has not changed. Or only very slightly. We have this system of a kind of total rigor mortis at the top, where they cannot absorb the science and information coming up from below.
Well, that's interesting because, as you know, I'm working on my third movie, and this time I'm going deep. I'm going after vegans. I'm asking vegans the how and the why, because I want to answer these questions these very questions that you brought up years ago that we still have today. And I've sent letters out to everyone. Walter Willett, still haven't heard back from him to be in a movie. I want these people to speak their piece. I'm tired of these movies where it's like, hey, look at this one side, and I'm going to get you to believe this one side.
That would be called propaganda.
Yeah, exactly. And I didn't want to become that guy. I didn't want to become the next guy doing, Cowspiracy and What the Health and Game Changers, because it's so easy to pick those movies apart. And so I said, okay, I'm going to get the Nina Teicholz of the world, the Frederick Leroy's of the world, the Mittlerners of the world, but I'm going to also ask people such as Grieger. Grieger actually said yes.
That's good.
And then a couple of days later, he wrote back and said, "I'm sorry, I will be busy at that time." And my reply to him was, "That's very interesting because I didn't give you a time. I just asked you if you would be in my movie." But he said he would be busy at the time of
or any time.
At any time, right? So he was gracefully bowing out. I do have one vegan on the hook. I'm not going to mention his name because I don't want him to hear this and go, "Oh wait, they're going to do something to me in the movie." So I have one of those vegan doctors that agreed to it. I'll tell you who it is off the air. But I'm hoping he shows up because I want to hear that side of the story. I'm not going to take their words. I'm not going to twist them around. I want to hear things like, how does this create climate change? I'm not a climate denier, but there's a fact. We have the temperature rising on, on the planet, right? I know that. We have ice caps melting. We know that. I want to know why we think it's from cows burping, because there is no science behind that. None. There's more science behind every other industry causing that, including the fake meat industry, which will be spewing more crap into the atmosphere, because that's not a zero-sum game. They will have to make that stuff in a factory. Where's all of that going to go? Where's all those gases going to go? There's got to be CO2 gases being emitted when you're making Beyond Burgers and Impossible Burgers and every other kind of burger that has some fake heme in it, right? I've already discovered from the movie that most of these ingredients are produced in China, and we know that they're not regulated. So it's going to be a very interesting thing that's going on here. I want to hear from the same people that were in Game Changers who thought that was a good idea, but they're not returning my phone call. And I'm keeping all of their rejection letters so that people can see that that I really went after these people and tried to get them to be in my movie. They just won't do it. Whenever I see Joel Kahn popping up on my Twitter, he used to fake it for 1 or 2 rounds. He just goes right to ad hominem now. He's not even trying to fake it anymore. I don't know what he's doing with you, but that's what he does with me. My question is, why can't we get to the truth? There's a universal truth here. I think we have enough information to get to some kind of truth, but we're not getting there. What say you?
I definitely think that the people in charge who are controlling nutrition policy, they don't want to see truth, right? So they're not interested in truth. I have had numerous invitations out by top people at universities saying, why don't you debate Nina Teicholz, Marion Nessel, who's a very well-known expert at NYU. People at her university have said, please come and debate Nina Teicholz. She won't do it. They won't engage in debates. They don't want to engage in conversations. They don't want us speaking at their events, or they don't want to come to debate or to talk about these issues, because I think that their arguments just would not stand up. And that's the problem. You see it over and over on Twitter, where somebody starts one of the only really platforms that we have for debate. Well, somebody will start an argument with one of the vegan doctors, and the vegan doctor will bring up all the epidemiology, which is that observational evidence, but shows shows an association, but not causation, right? So very weak type of science. And the the diligent other person on Twitter will say, well, that's a weak type of science and it cannot show cause and effect, and you cannot use that to make decisions. For instance, as I always say, your doctor would never give you a pill based on this kind of weak associational evidence. And after that point has been made, because that is all the evidence that exists to supposedly show that meat is bad for health, or that dairy is bad for health, or that eggs are bad for health. And as soon as that point is made, and basically, you've won, because there's no comeback to that. There's no, cannot defend that science. It is an inherently weak science, and the findings that they have are all, weak associations based on a weak science. After that conversation, that's the end, and then it's basically on to ad hominem attacks. Well, you're just a journalist, or you don't know what you're doing, and you don't have any degrees, and there's just these. It just descends into ad hominem, non-logical conversation, because there is no place to go. And if I've made these arguments also in peer-reviewed journals, and and nobody cites them, or nobody will talk about them, or you'll be censored for them. There's really, the problem is that when huge institutions like the U.S. government gets itself behind a certain idea about nutrition, that idea currently being fruits, vegetables, whole grains is what you need to eat to be healthy, maybe some nuts and seeds, and less of all the other stuff. and the food industry is invested in this, and the pharmaceutical industry is invested in this, and the whole US government, the whole federal government, and all of its programs, and all its feeding assistance programs, its school lunches, everything is invested in this idea of what's a healthy diet. And then come along all these arguments to the contrary, you know, that your diet's based on weak evidence. You're ignoring all the massive amount of evidence to the contrary. You're stuffing that science, literally ignoring it to the point where it's just, it's unbelievable, you know, that, but there's no way to have a debate because the consequences are too great. I think the only possible response is to try to shut it down, because the consequences of all of that being wrong are so devastating to so many people and their reputations, but also so many institutions and so much industry. So
there's so much money, but I think the money is probably the biggest problem. Hang on just a sec. I want to move it in a different direction just a little bit, because, you know, it's something that scares people who listen to this podcast. I talk to people every day. Before we do that, folks, purevitaminclub.com. It's a company that I created. I own it. You're looking at the forefather. I'm the guy who started purevitaminclub.com. Why did I start that company? Well, once I had cancer, I started looking at everything that went. I thought I was the healthiest guy in the world. Like Nina, I wasn't eating seed oils. I wasn't doing any of that, but still I got cancer. And I started looking at everything. And I started reading even the back of vitamin bottles. And I started seeing things like titanium dioxide and magnesium stearate. And at first I was confused by magnesium stearate. Well, it's magnesium. It's got to be good for you. But stearate, what is that word? I started looking into some of the stuff and realizing that it didn't have to be there at all. As a matter of fact, I did a deep dive on titanium dioxide to find out that even in nanoparticles, it could cause colon cancer. Yuck, who wants that? It can kill you really fast. So I set out to make the best vitamin in the world, and voila, 3 years after I started, along with the help of my buddy Andy Schreiber, we put out our multivitamin. Now we have a whole array of vitamins out there. They're all completely pure. The efficacy is there in these vitamins. I literally secretly pulled my vitamins. I'll just pull one bottle of this and that off the line and get them privately tested to make sure that nothing is ever being put into my vitamins. purevitaminclub.com, the purest vitamins on the planet. I would give you a promo code, but I can't, because the other thing I did was I made the world's best vitamin, the world's most affordable vitamin. So go check out what we're doing there. A 90-day supply, you'll realize you're spending pennies per day, not dollars per day. And you'll go, oh, wait, this just makes sense for me, my family, and my kids. purevitaminclub.com. Go check it out. Right now, we're talking to Nina Teicholz. Nina, every day I do these consults. My accountant has been telling me for years, you have to stop these consults, but I won't. The reason he tells me that is because he's telling me I'm not using my time wisely. Everyone's always trying to tell me how to work smarter, not harder, but I need to talk to people, not on Twitter. I talk to them on Twitter every day. I need to interview people. I need to teach. And the only way I could do that is with these consults. So people sign up. They get a lot out of it because in either a half an hour or an hour, they get a ton out of it. But more so, I get a ton out of it because I'm coaching. And when you're coaching, you're learning. I've been teaching ever since I left college in 1984. The one thing that I get over and over and over again is, hey, I've been doing this NSNG, some form of low carb, keto, you name it. I've lost X amount of weight. My triglycerides are way down, but my wife / husband / lover / brother, sister thinks I'm killing myself with all this red meat and all these eggs. And my doctor has been telling me I need to stop. And my doctor's telling me I'm going to die before next Tuesday if I keep this up. Now, Nina, I understand their hesitation because just a couple of weeks ago at 58 years old, Serena made me go visit a a primary care doctor. I've never had one. I never knew you needed one. But Serena goes, everyone needs a PCP, primary care. Yeah, I got that right.
Physician.
Yeah. And I said, why don't I need that? It's like, well, they tell you, if you need something, they tell you which doctor to go to. And I said, well, my whole life, if I needed a doctor because I broke a bone, I just went to that guy. If I, did something else, I went to that guy. If I had a stomach flu, I went to a gastroenterologist. I just went to the right guy. But nowadays, you need to go visit a guy, pay that guy, and then he'll send you to another guy.
Right. That's right.
So
it's the guy chain or the girl chain.
Or the girl chain. In this case, it was a female doctor and very lovely woman. I was a bit suspect when I walked into the office. Now, I will give them a buy round on this because it was a few days before Easter, and there was a candy bowl full of chocolate sitting there. So the person I'm going to visit to make me better has a bowl of carcinogens sitting right there in the front office for everyone to enjoy. And I did take note that none of the candy in there was actually like an egg shape or whatever. It wasn't Easter candy, so I'm guessing it's there all the time. I go in, she reads my chart. They ask me what I eat and the whole thing, and she's on me about the eggs. You eat how many eggs a day? Somewhere between 6 and 10. You eat steak every day? Yes, I do. She did blood work. She noticed my triglycerides were somewhere around 60. They noticed that my blood sugar was below 80. And they said my cholesterol was high, Nina. My cholesterol was not in the 200s. They did note that my cholesterol was, my ratios were there. So when she calls to give me the bad news about my cholesterol and starts waxing on about a statin, I said, hang on, doc. You sent me to get a calcium scan. Yes, that's right here. What was my calcium score? She looks and she goes, it's a 0. Interesting. My triglycerides were what? Oh, it's like 16. Blood sugar was what? Oh, it's 80. Okay. My cholesterol, my ratios are perfect. Did you do a particle test? No, we don't do that. We don't do that. You mean the one test that would prove if I have a problem you didn't do? That's correct. Now, before I called her back to have this consult, I also called my buddy, Dr. Brett Shear, who said, no way in hell do you need a statin or anything close to a statin. You're perfect, right? You have nothing to worry about. Yet I had another doctor telling me after I spoke to the expert that you need to be on a statin.
Yeah.
It made 0 sense. Now, I get this phone call every day. I'm not a doctor. I can't tell people not to take statins. And I tell them that on the phone calls. But I direct them to people like Brett Shear and other doctors like that, Eric Westman, Brian Linskas. I tell them, call these guys, call real doctors who are up on the information. If I hadn't had the information I had last week or 2 weeks ago, I would have been scared shitless, right? Wouldn't you? If a doctor goes, listen, your cholesterol is high, you need to be on a statin. If I didn't know what those other numbers meant, how would you feel if that had happened to you and you weren't Nina Teicholz and you were just a layperson and you didn't have the information? What would you have thought by going to this professional?
Yeah, I mean, of course. I mean, most everybody I know has a very similar story to yours. And I know, people go on statins, people keep their statins in their drawer, not sure what they're supposed to do, not sure, don't want to go up against their doctor. The doctors have to sign something saying my patient's being non-compliant. And they don't understand, they never really talk about the side effects of statins, although a little more openly now is there really a conversation about the pretty serious side effects of statins. Yeah. It's interesting. I don't know if I put this in my book, but when I was doing my research, I found that it used to be that, statins have evolved over time to try to, my interpretation is to include as many people as possible needing a statin, right? So right. It used to be that you had to have it used to look at your total cholesterol and say, well, if your total cholesterol is over, I can't remember now, but 180 or something, then you need a statin. Then they decided a panel with scientists, all of whom, 100% of whom had conflicts of interest in the drug industry, meaning they all took money from pharmaceutical companies that made statins. That panel, expert panel, decided to lower the cholesterol number down, thereby making, this was maybe in the late 80s, thereby making, another 100 million people need to have statins, right, because the number went down. Then they moved it over to LDL cholesterol.
That's my favorite move. That was my favorite move, Nina.
Yeah, because it turned out total cholesterol really did not track well with heart attack risk, even though most of us still talk about most doctors still talk about total cholesterol as if it matters. It doesn't matter at all.
Right.
And especially it doesn't matter for women. I mean, one of the things I researched for my book was the different cholesterol numbers for women. For women, from middle age up, the higher your cholesterol, the more likely you are to live longer. But your doctor will never tell you that. And the health authorities decided to stuff all the data on women because it was too complicated to have different guidance for women versus men. So they just went with the data on men. Yeah, then they shifted to LDL cholesterol. Well, guess what? It turns out that your LDL cholesterol, which they also lowered the number, progressively lowered the number, so you had to get it lower and lower.
Right.
It turns out that LDL cholesterol does not track with your risk for a heart attack. It just doesn't. And when you look at the long-term data on it, LDL tracks poorly with your heart attack risk. And what tracks better? Well, what you were getting at, your LDL particle. LDL comes in different sizes, and you need to look at the particle density of it. But the whole cholesterol story is just like whack-a-mole. It just was like, we have this idea that cholesterol is in your blood, reflects heart disease. And so we're just going to keep chasing it into something else. And it's because the statin industry, and now it's the PCSK9 inhibitors. I mean, they just they can't give up this model. And it's the biggest ever drug in the history of the pharmaceutical industry is the statin industry.
Yes.
So it is a huge financial incentive to have everybody on a statin. I'm not against them. What's the irony of statins is they may work in some way. I think they actually may work, but not because they lower your cholesterol. There is what's called these so-called pleiotropic effects, which is translated into I don't know effects of cholesterol that may in fact be beneficial, but they don't know what it is. And so if you are not having side effects, it could be that statins can help you. But, I think, any prospect where you're taking a drug for your whole life, depending on a drug for your whole life is a drug that has not been tested for people's whole lives is a risky thing.
Absolutely. And, look, I've asked several cardiologists, and this is not settled science, but I said, who really needs a statin? There's a guy who I shoot skeet and sporting clay with. He's a pretty famous cardiologist up in DC. And he said, if you have hardware in your heart, in other words, if they had to put stents in and you have a lot of blockage, I can make a case for statins, but putting healthy people on statins just because is not a thing. And this is a cardiologist. This is a guy, by the way, he's not an electrician, he's a plumber. He's a guy that goes in after the heart attack and tries to get the plaque out, puts stents in, this kind of thing. He does open heart surgery every time he goes to work. And he says there's a case for it, but it's not for everyone. This is a cardiologist, right? And this is him talking to me privately over scotch after a shooting event. This is not, what he's saying on any large scale, because he would then lose his job too. And this is the pressure that these guys are under, right? They're under this pressure of, if we don't tell people they have to be on this drug and they drop dead, it's on us. So if we want to have our malpractice covered, or however that works, and I'm not really sure how it works, that's what they have to do, right? And it's a very scary thing that we have all of these people. Nina, early on in this podcast, probably 8 years ago, maybe 9, it was probably in the first year, I went to my hometown in southern Louisiana, right on the bayou. And whenever I would go home, I would see my mom, my dad, my brothers. I would hop on a plane and leave again. But on this particular day, I heard about my cousin who was, they get together on, this is so southern, you're not going to believe this, but they get together on their front porch, a couple of houses in a row, and they might have a barbecue. Everyone brings potluck. They start drinking, what have you. I heard one of these parties were going on this summer evening, and I figured I'd go over and say hi to my relatives because they were going to all be in one spot at the same time. What I did not expect to see was maybe 25 or 30 people who were not related to me there also, because everyone just shows up, right? And these are people who I graduated high school with in a lot of cases. Maybe the year before me, maybe the year after me, but we're all roughly the same age. And I haven't seen a lot of these people since I graduated high school. I'm the guy who got away. I went to New Orleans, to Tulane. I lived in New Orleans for several years after that, and then moved straight to LA, and largely have not seen these people in all of those years. We're catching up. I did notice that I was the only guy of normal weight. This is not any kind of indictment on these folks. They're trying, they're doing the best they can. But most of them were morbidly obese. Just by, just visually, I can tell you they were morbidly obese. And at least everyone who spoke to me about this, because when you're the guy holding up the mirror, right? When you're the thin guy and they know what you do for a living in Hollywood, they're going to start asking questions privately. And I started getting the question, hey man, how many medications do you take? And I was thrown by that question. I really was. I said, what come again? How many medications are you on? It was, yeah, I'm on zero. When I had cancer, I had to take chemo, but and I said, come on, man, you don't have to be cool with me. How many medications? And then another guy walked into the conversation and said, can you believe this joker's telling me he's not on medications? I'm on 5. You're on 7. Another girl walked up. I'm on 6 medications. Everybody was on somewhere between 4 and 7 medications. Metformin, statins, something to counteract the statin, something to counteract metformin. It was, something for fatty liver disease. They were on drug after drug after drug. So I started interviewing people, and it turns out I was the only guy there that wasn't taking at least something.
Wow.
And I thought, wow, what, these people aren't only morbidly obese, they're dying. They're dying quicker than they should be, right? I'm happy to say we haven't lost any of them yet, but we're not 60 yet, right? I'm 58. No one in that group is 60, but I don't think some of these people are going to make it to 70 or 75. I really don't. And that's a sad tableau. It shouldn't be that way. And when people say, well, Vinnie, why do you care? Why do you care? It's like, I care because I have friends and I have family. And that's why I care. That's why I'm so passionate about this. It's not about everyone else that we talk to when we do these sort of things. We have friends and family, and they're not healthy, and they're taking drugs, and it really pisses me off. What say you?
I mean, that's the story of America. I care about my friends and family, and I can't help but think about all those people out there. I mean, all of America, that's their story. 88% of Americans are metabolically unwell and have metabolic syndrome, which means some combination of obesity, diabetes, heart disease, fatty liver disease, all of those diseases that are basically have as their root cause this metabolic disorder, or call it insulin resistance. I mean, everybody's got it. And they go to their doctor, and their doctor's well-meaning and says, you need to eat more fruits, vegetables, and whole grains. And they go back and they do their best to follow that diet, and they exercise, and then they get worse. And then the doctor says, I'm really sorry that didn't work out. I knew the diet would fail, unfortunately, because it always fails. And then they start putting on medications. And that's our broken medical system. And it's a lot worse if you're poor in America, because then you're also getting the government food, school lunches, school breakfast, feeding programs to the elderly, baskets of food from women and infant children. And that food is boxes of cereal and bottles of juice. And, if you're lucky, there's an egg in there. There's definitely no meat. So, we have a brutal system. I mean, our government is basically killing people with their diet. And our whole system is making people sick and unwell, and is suppressing the truth about how people can get well. So it looks pretty bad. And, people like you and me, we can write and we can podcast and you can meet with your clients. But it is, there's nothing like somebody's doctor. I can tell you, people trust doctors more than they trust almost anyone else in America. So, even I will go to my mom and say, hey, Mom, I think you should give up that low-fat yogurt because it's really high in sugar. And she'll say, okay, honey, I'll go ask my doctor.
Yeah, Nina, you're Nina Teicholz and your mom won't listen to you. You know what I mean? I don't know if you know the story or not, but my mom fell during last summer, and she broke her left knee and her right shoulder. And when they were releasing her from the hospital, they were going to send her to one of these homes to rehabilitate. And I said, the hell you will, there's COVID and my mom is elderly and the people are dying in these homes in Louisiana. So I took it upon myself to go home and become my mom's nurse because my dad, he's still around, but he's not strong enough. Someone had to take care of these two people. And since I was the caretaker, on day one, I went through their fridge and basically threw out everything. I don't know who my parents became, but when we were kids, it was fresh meat, fresh milk, great dairy. The eggs came from the lady down the street, you name it. All of a sudden, my parents are, there was something called Eggos. I'm not making this up. And there was other products like this, frozen crap, and they were eating seed oils and everything else. And there was Jif peanut butter in the fridge. My grandmother used to make this stuff fresh. And I threw it all out. My dad, who grew up during the Depression, said, well, what are you doing? What are you doing? And he was pulling stuff out of the garbage can, and we had a big argument. So then I went to a grocery store and got all good fresh foods. A lot of fish, a lot of red meat, a lot of great stuff. And I was cooking for him around the clock. Lo and behold, my mom, while sitting there, she couldn't move unless I picked her up and got her to the bathroom or got her to bed. She was in a wheelchair. My mom, in the 6 weeks, lost 20 some odd pounds. My dad, who was not trying that hard, lost 15 or 20 pounds. And then when I left, they decided to keep eating that way. They decided that after 7 weeks, they decided to keep doing what I had taught them. And they kept eating fresh food. They never went back to the crap. My mom got worried because she went down to a weight that she hadn't seen since high school, since she was 16 years old. My dad looks better than ever. But it would take a Nina Teicholz to move to Berkeley and live with your parents. You would have to strap them down if they're not hurt, and basically force feed them to eat what you're going to feed them. Otherwise, it's not going to happen.
Well, I think that, at the moment, because the medical establishment is not embracing real food that would actually make people healthy, there are people who, without round-the-clock cooking, and my hat off to you, Vinnie, for doing that for your parents. That's an incredible feat of devotion. No hats off. It was a pleasure to do it because when you move away from home at 18 and and I go home a lot, but it's always, hey, how you doing? Glad handing a quick meal or two and you're out. I got to immerse myself in their life again. And it was very special because they're not going to be around forever. And I'm glad I had that opportunity. It was, look, I'm an atheist, but is it odd or is it God?
And this is one of those situations where I went, huh, look at this. This is great. This is good. I wouldn't have ever done it. No one would ever do it unless you're forced to do it. Right.
Right.
So, yeah, this is not a kudos to you. This was a vacation for me. This was a pleasure to go home and take care of. Look, I broke my leg when I was in 7th grade in a football game. I was in a body cast. My mom had to, put the bedpan under me every day for 6, 7 weeks while I was in bed. Shoulder injuries. I mean, that woman my parents did for me just an immeasurable amount for me and my brothers. And it's incredible who they were, and they deserve even more than I was able to give. But go on.
No, I mean, I'm currently taking care of my children, one of whom has a broken leg. So I'm on the other end of that. But I was going to say is that I in terms of this idea of changing people's minds, I think is how to get people to change long-time habits. People are always asking me, I can't, I can't change anybody's mind. I can't, how do you get somebody to think differently? And they tell me I'm killing myself. And how do I get them to listen to me? How do I persuade people to do something different for them, or for their own health? At the moment, there is this incredible bottom-up movement of people who have kind of just taken their health into their own hands, looked around, spent some time on the internet, gone down the rabbit hole a little bit, watched a bunch of videos. And I get emails from them, I'm sure you do too, where they say, you know what? I watched your videos, I watched this guy's videos, that woman's videos, and now I just realized that totally makes sense, and I've completely changed my diet, and I fixed all my health problems. And these people really amaze me, but I think it's a certain kind of person who probably doesn't follow or respect authorities as much as other people. And in that respect, for good, for better or for worse, is a little more open-minded. It tends to be the mavericks out there, people who are willing to kind of buck conventional wisdom, think differently. And they maybe have seen their friends get healthy. So there's the power of the word, you and your friends all getting together on the front porch. That sometimes, that also is powerful. But the reason that I started a group, the Nutrition Coalition, to try to change it from the top down, is that there are so many people who really are not independent thinkers, or they do not they cannot change their minds, or they're too much into this this way of thinking, despite the observations, despite seeing a Vinnie Tortorich, who's on no medication and looks like a god. They still cannot, they're blinded. Their eyes are blinded to what they see right in front of themselves. And that population is, most of America probably, and they're listening to their doctors and they're getting sicker, and not to mention the poor people who are just have to eat what the government food that is given to them if they're in that situation. And that all of those costs, let's put aside the enormous human suffering that we're all seeing, but the cost, diabetes alone is the single biggest driver of rising healthcare costs in this country. Chronic disease in general is the lion's share of healthcare costs. People think, how do we bring down healthcare costs? How do we bring down healthcare costs? It's also the biggest item of all discretional spending in the US budget. So there has to be change. And, my group is currently the only organization in the United States that's working on this issue. And we need support. We need people to realize this is a huge existential problem for the United States. The $350 billion plus that we spend annually on diabetes. Think about if that money were instead spent on research into how to live longer, have better performance, how to all live to age 100 instead. Instead, we're sending it down the, just an absolute pit, a money pit, to help people go on dialysis, get their limbs cut off, endless amounts of insulin, die early, die slow, painful, miserable deaths. Is that what we want to do as a nation?
Well, Nina, look, and this gets into the political, which I don't do here nor anywhere else in my life. But, we talk about the homeless situation in this country, and we know that a lot of these people are addicted to something or rather, or have mental illness. What if that money, all that money from diabetes, could be just moved over to help these people, right?
Yeah.
Get these people, to have organizations and hospitals or places for these people to go. The biggest problem is we have people and we don't have any place for them to go, right? So this would be a great way to make that happen, if we could just reappropriate that money. But we're not doing that. We keep going down the wrong rabbit hole. And I look at the military. Our military is getting fatter and fatter. I've often said, at some point, China can just come in here and take this country without, shooting one shot, because we'll be too fat and sick and dead to do anything. Right.
Yeah.
So it all becomes a problem. Nina, we got to go, but I want you to let people know how they can help the Nutrition Coalition. How can they find you? Is there a place where people can donate? Can I donate? Well, how do we do this? How do we help you with your organization?
Thank you for asking. You can go to nutritioncoalition.us and just hit the donate button. And we're a 501c3. It's tax deductible, and we would really appreciate donations. You can reach me also through, if you're a member of the public, on my website, ninateichels.com, and there's a place to send me a message if you're interested in talking more seriously about a donation. But this is the issue for America. We cannot live with 88% of us diseased and unable to show up for work and dying early, and I might add, far more susceptible to COVID. I mean, the link between obesity and high blood sugar is the strongest association that they have found for poor outcomes from COVID. The reason the hospitals are full, the reason those death rates are high anywhere and in America and anywhere else, is due to obesity and high blood sugar. So there's a pretty good argument to be made that we have all suffered these horrendous lockdowns and everything we've gone through because we have a fat and sick nation. You look at places like Vietnam, where there's very low obesity. There was no COVID. It's places like India, Mexico, the United States with high obesity rates. There's a perfect correlation there. And if they look at the really rigorous studies that have now been replicated numerous times, it's these conditions that have made us, lowered our immune system, made us more compromised in terms of our metabolic health, and made us more susceptible to COVID. So please do donate to the Nutrition Coalition. That would be great.
It will be in the show notes. We'll have it at vinnietortorich.com. We'll also have it in the show notes on YouTube, folks. We recorded this show for YouTube. It's something new for me. We've been doing it for a couple of weeks. This is one of the early YouTube shows. So if you want to watch Nina and myself, you can just go straight to YouTube and it'll be there also. But the Nutrition Coalition and how you can give to that organization will be in the show notes. Hang on, Nina. I want to say goodbye to you off the air, folks. Cappelli is the longest running sponsor of this show. It's why they're the main reason that we were able to keep going in the early days. We were getting enough money to keep this show running. It cost a lot with the bandwidth. We now have a lot of people working on this show. That we have a new member, Gary Smith, now works on this show along with Megan and the Scott and Bill and Anna and Gina. All of these people, they have to make a living. This show, you guys kept us going through COVID, which is great. Cappelli is the best olive oil on the planet. Go check it out at villacappelli.com. Let them know we sent you by putting in promo code Vinnie, and they will reward you by giving you 10% off your entire order. If you spend over $99 after the discount of 10%, so you might have to spend like $115, you'll be over $100, and you will get free shipping along with that. 10% discount across the board, but free shipping after $100, including discount. So go check out villacappelli.com, promo code Vinnie, V-I-N-N-I-E, no wimpy Y. You want to go and do that. But you know about what to do. You can go to VinnieTortorich.com before you go to Amazon. It puts coal on the fire. It gets my train down the track. You will also find Nina's book there. The book is called The Big Fat Surprise, or is it Big Fat Surprise? It's Big Fat Surprise, not The Big Fat Surprise. Is it, Nina?
It's that Big Fat Surprise.
The big fat, I call it Big Fat Surprise. The Big Fat Surprise, but you'll see it on Vinnie's book list. We were talking about this great country with Nina, so we're going to end with that. On behalf of Nina and Teicholz, my name is Vinnie Tortorich. Put life into living and do it with enthusiasm.